Hear these words from the prophet Isaiah. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. Please pray with me. Holy One, there is much about the world to lament these days. We carry a stream of low-level or high-level anxiety over so many things. And yet you are our God, and we need not be afraid. Help us to hear your word of hope in the midst of sorrow, to see a path forward in the midst of challenges. Show us a way where it seems as if there is no way. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be an acceptable offering for you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The worst sermon I ever preached was the Sunday after 9/11, 2001. I was pastoring a church in Colorado at the time. We had church members with family working in Manhattan. Everybody knew somebody impacted. Friends on Wall Street. People were in shock, afraid, generally a wreck. What happened? What's going to happen next? Why did this happen? Whose fault is it? Our questions became anguished cries in the dark. My husband Ellis and I had just decided to adopt a 7-year-old girl who on 9/11 had been living with us only a few short months. We knew that her family came from New York, yet little did we know that we'd be flying to Kennedy International Airport less than a month after 9/11 for the funeral of our new daughter's birth mother. When we journeyed down to Lower Manhattan after the funeral, the air was still thick with the smell of chemicals burning. Police officers wandered in a daze. Weeping families left bunches of flowers along a fence. One officer stood looking up towards the sky, and I paused to ask him what he was seeing. His eyes filled with tears as he remembered watching people jump from the high tower windows rather than succumb to the fires. Weeks after the tragedy, he was still in shock. It was an awful time for all of us in every direction. You remember, wasn't it? Now, at the church I served there, we did do some things right. We had an automatic call system that, in case of emergency, could send out an invitation, which we did, to a prayer vigil the night the towers came down. Yet 5 days after the disaster, my sermon utterly missed the mark. I couldn't tell you what I actually said, and nobody told me I was a failure as a pastor, but I walked away having gone from one of the worst things anybody had ever experienced right to forgiveness, healing, and reconciliation without naming and making room for our overwhelming collective grief. It would be another decade before I discovered what I had missed that Sunday, following one of the worst events in recent U.S. history. I had forgotten to help the congregation lament. Among Jesus' last words from the cross were these words from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Thank God for the Psalms of lament. The word lament means a passionate expression of grief or sorrow. When something disastrous faces us collectively as a community or as a nation, or when we've royally screwed things up personally, there is nothing to be done for it but to sit with it and experience the pain. Though we humans sometimes reach for it, there is no drug, legal or otherwise, that can take away this kind of hurt. I once spoke to a therapist who works a good deal with people who grieve, and she observed a common pattern among those going through loss or betrayal or a shame of having done something that caused real harm to themselves or others. The kind of stuff once unleashed that we can't put back in the box. You know what I'm talking about, no matter how much we wish it were so. One of her clients came to see her asking for a shortcut out of suffering, only to have her very patient therapist remind her that there is no escape route out. Only the companionship of others accompanying us through. The psalm that Jesus quoted from the cross, among many psalms of lament, provide us with an essential spiritual pattern for how to get through suffering we all experience. First, Jesus cried out in anguish. He experienced a kind of suffering that everyone who loved him would have given anything to remove from him, a relief for which he too prayed. He cried out the first line of Psalm 22 that proclaimed the loneliness and anguish of suffering. And when we're sad or afraid, it hurts. My God, it hurts. Such seasons of struggle are sometimes referred to as the dark night of the soul, a concept from a poem of the same name written by John of the Cross. Through painful and difficult times, we have each taken turns going through a dark night of the soul. As people of faith, we're not immune from doubt or fear or anger or loneliness or grief or pain. Such seasons may last a long time, and they can even precipitate a crisis of faith. Yet God is faithful. Jesus and all his gathered family and friends would have known that following the cry of anguish, Psalm 22 next affirms the memory of how God sustained the community through troubles of the past. This memory gives hope to the one who suffers. Though the suffering may not be shortened, nevertheless, there's hope in recalling that if God saw us through that then, whatever that was, surely God will see us through the this now, whatever it is we're facing. God brought us through the Civil War, Pearl Harbor, the World Wars, Vietnam, the murder in the 1960s of national leaders, and yes, 9/11. We tell stories of how God gave us the courage and the strength when we were going through an impossible season to go on after hurricanes or floods or fires or a significant loss. The next pattern of the Psalms moves from the reminder that God has always been with us collectively in times of trouble to the confession that the psalmist may have contributed to his own suffering. He says he's a worm and not human, despised by people who mock him and sneer at him and shake their heads. He feels guilty and ashamed. We don't know what the writer has done or what people believe he has done. We only know how they respond by kicking him when he's down. So this psalm that you only heard today, the first 11 verses, it goes on through verse 31. The next words of the psalmist expresses affirmation that even though he's messed up, he knows that God has been with him from the time he was an infant, protected and held in his mother's arms. Though suffering over whatever it is that he has said or done, the writer of this psalm also feels besieged by others through no fault of his own. The psalm doesn't say what he's up against, yet he continues with prayer for God to draw near as he goes through a really terrible time Do not be far from me, O God, for trouble is near and there's no one to help me. For dogs are all around me, a company of evildoers encircles me. They bind my hands and feet, they count my bones and gloat over me. Sometimes we humans hurt, and we hurt deeply, and we may hurt for a long time. People who do not have faith suffer. People who do have faith suffer. To be human is at some point to experience suffering that we would prefer, thank you please, to avoid or escape. I know many of you study the work of Dr. Brené Brown, a professor, writer, and social worker whose work on shame and vulnerability and subsequent writing and TED Talks continue to inspire wholehearted living. She's also a person of faith. In one of her earliest works, The Gifts of Imperfection, she challenges our tendency to believe that if only we could look perfect and lead perfect lives, we'd no longer feel inadequate and we could therefore avoid suffering. That is not true. We can't do it perfectly enough to never suffer. Brown explores how we can cultivate the courage, compassion, and connection to wake up in the morning and face our trouble, accompanied by others in community who will walk with us, and companioned by our God, whose consolation may indeed seem very far away from us when we're in the middle of the muddle. The presence of God there nevertheless makes it possible for us to say, yes, I'm afraid, but I'm also brave. Yes, I'm profoundly flawed and imperfect, but that doesn't change the fact that I am worthy of love and belonging. In her next works, Daring Greatly and Dare to Lead, Brown teaches individuals and businesses, nonprofits, and the military how to live bravely. She teaches how not only to be vulnerable and fully experience life's challenges, but also courageous. And finally, in one of her later works, Rising Strong, she asks the central question of our psalmist today. When we've stumbled or fallen, when we've been betrayed or betrayed another, when we've behaved badly or failed at something that deeply matters to us, in short, when we have landed, boom, flat on our face, how on earth do we rise again? Like the psalmist who names their loneliness and isolation, Dr. Brown suggests that we lean into the lament, that we name it, that we experience it fully, that we can't skip from chaos right over to healing and reconciliation without facing and experience the pain of what has happened. She quotes Margaret Atwood in her work, Alias Grace, to describe this suffering in the middle, though not caused by God, that it's nevertheless a normal and necessary part of human life, and we can walk around filled with shame because we think we're the only one in this mess, but we all are in this mess, have been or will be again. Atwood writes, when you are in the middle of a story, it isn't a story at all, but only a confusion, a dark roaring, a blindness, a wreckage of shattered glass and splintered wood, like a house in a whirlwind, or else a boat crushed on the icebergs or swept over the rapids, and all aboard, powerless to stop it. It's only afterwards that anything becomes like a story at all, when you're telling it to yourself or someone else from the future. It's only looking back after we felt the pain and cleared the rubble that we can see how God had us all along. If we resist skipping the pain, saying, I'm just fine, don't worry about it, no problem, when we're feeling crushed inside, we will remain an anxious wad stuck, our lives curved in and closed in upon ourselves. C.S. Lewis, who lost his beloved wife Joy to cancer, had an observation about this. He said, to love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will be surely wrung and it will possibly break. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give it to no one, not even an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change, that love. It will not be broken, that heart. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, hard, irredeemable. To love is to be vulnerable. When we courageously name and face our suffering, we may then experience the possibility of authentic hope for a future we can't see from the center of the chaos. Through the years, so many people have asked me how God could so have abandoned Jesus, his beloved Son, which is also a code for this question. If God could have abandoned Jesus at his hour of greatest need, will God abandon us now? Will God abandon me? Hear then God's really good news for you and for me during these uncertain times. Jesus' story didn't end with being forsaken. Even from the cross, Jesus spent his last breath crying out the opening words to a psalm that ended in hope. Jesus' story ended with life, and through faith, ours will too. The conclusion that he knew in his body as he died and yet lived was this: all the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all of the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and God rules over all the nations. Posterity will serve God. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, God has done it. The word of hope for the people of God. Thanks be to God.